Okay, this is a continuation of the last podcast. So, we just went over the rules for significant figures, and now we want to know um, what, how do we round after we add or subtract or multiply and add? So, here's a slide on the rules on how to round after adding or subtracting. So, if you look at the numbers here, 20.42, 1.3, 32, 83.1. When we're adding or subtracting, we don't look at the sig figs of each number. Instead, what we look at is the decimal place. So we want to look for the number with the least number of decimal places. And that number turns out to be 83.1. So notice how 83.1 has one decimal place. This has two. This has three, and this has two. So one is the least decimal place. Um, Therefore, our answer should have one decimal place. So it says here, when you add or subtract numbers, the answer has the same number of decimal places as the number with the least decimal place. So the least decimal place is 1. So our answer must have 1 decimal place. So we're going to round this to 104.8. So there it is. 104.8 will be our correct answer. Here's another example. 3 measurements were recorded. Anytime you record an answer or you make a measurement from it, the numbers are going to be inexact. So the question A says, accurately show the sum of those measurements. So you add them up, and you're going to get 0.529. Now, when adding or subtracting, you have to look at the least decimal place. So there's 3 here, there's 1 here, and there's 2 here. That means that the least decimal place will be 1. So our answer is going to be rounded to 0.5 because it has 1 decimal place. Are the 3 numbers precise? And the answer is no, they're not even close to one another. Okay, you have to look at it from one digit. So 0.39, 0.4, very different numbers. Okay. Now, what would happen if we multiply or divide? Do the same rules apply? And the answer is no, they don't. They're very different. So when you add or subtract, you look at the least decimal place. When you multiply and divide, you round to the least sig fig. So here, for example, we're looking at the area, length times width. 6.221, 4 sig figs here, times 2 sig figs here. So which of these 2 sig figs is the smallest 2? So our answer must have 2 sig figs, not 2 decimal places, 2 sig figs. Okay, so look, 2 sig figs. If we round this, it would be 32. 32 has 2 sig figs, so that must be our answer. Here's another example. This time it involves volume. Volume is length times width times height. However, when you're looking at a cylinder, it's actually pi r squared times h, right? So there should actually be an h here. There you go. I don't know why the h is missing. Oh, that's not good. Okay. Maybe, I hope my math is actually right. So, plug in the numbers. And if you look at the numbers, we're multiplying. Okay, we're multiplying. We're multiplying 3 things. So if we're multiplying, we're going to round to the least decimal place. I mean, not the least decimal place. We're going to be rounding to the least sig fig. 1.0 is 2, 5 is just 1. So we're going to round to 1 sig fig. When you plug it in, volume equals pi r squared times height. I made a mistake here, on purpose actually. So when we're doing math, people say, oh, 1.0, like, who cares? Just put 1. I want you guys to not ignore the zeros, okay? Make sure you put in the zeros, because if you don't, you're going to forget, and at the very end, you're going to round incorrectly. And if you're rounding correctly, the AP people are going to deduct a point. We don't want that, right? Um, so when you calculate this, you get 78.5. The least decimal place is, the least sig fig is 1. So we have to round to 1 sig fig. There's two ways to do it, actually. I actually did not think of the second way until way later. But whenever you want to shrink this into 1 sig fig, you tend to put it in scientific notation. So 8 times 10 to the 1 has 1 sig fig. The other way it would be to round this to 80, and 80 also has 1 sig fig. This doesn't always work, but 80 would be an acceptable answer too because there's no decimal, right? If there was a decimal here, then that would make it 2 sig figs, but it doesn't have one, so it's just 1. Now the next question here is, what happens? What happens if we have both adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing? How do we do that? And in algebra, we learned about something called PEMDAS. PEMDAS, parentheses, exponents, multiply, divide, add, subtract. We still have to use those algebra rules. And you're either going to multiply and divide or add or subtract. You're going to do one of those two sets. And after you've done one of those, you have to ask yourself this question: what is the next operation that I will perform on the number I just calculated? And that probably makes absolutely no sense to you. Um, so, this is the thing. If PEMDAS told you to multiply or divide first, okay? Let's say it told you to multiply or divide first. And then the next thing it tells you to do is to multiply and divide again. You don't have to round, okay? You don't have to round until the very end. And most of the time, you won't have to round until the very end because a lot of the equations are just multiplying and dividing. So you're not going to round until the end most of the time. But sometimes you will come up with situations where you're going to have to multiply and divide, but then you're going to have to add or subtract later on. And if you're going to multiply and divide first and then add and subtract, you have to round first and then do the next operation. So I'm going to multiply and divide and then round it, and then you're going to add and subtract and round it one more time. Okay, so hopefully that made sense. If that didn't, then here are some examples, some example problems. So it says compute. Compute means to calculate. Here we're being asked to multiply and then divide by the multiplication of these two numbers. So again, you have to do what's in parentheses first. So you multiply these two numbers, you get an answer, divided by the product of these two answers. Since it's all multiplication division, you don't have to round until the very end. So this times this gives you some number divided by 3.04, hit equals, and then divide by 3 again, and then hit equals. But it says multiplication, why did you just say divide? Well, you're dividing by these two numbers, so you have to divide by 3 also. Or the other way to do it is to multiply these two numbers, divide by the product of these two numbers, okay? That's another way to do it. So I need you to actually calculate this and see if you could get 1.279, so see if you're actually using your calculator correctly. According to the numbers, the least number of sig figs is 2, so my answer needs to be the 2 sig figs, so it's going to be 1.3. Now here's one that's a little more complicated, so you're including that second part of the complicated rules that we just talked about. It says to compute this addition and division, so you do what's in parentheses first. You're adding first, and remember, when you add or subtract, you round to the least decimal, so this is 1 decimal place, divided by, again, what's in parentheses, so you're going to do this second, and again, 1 decimal place will be the smallest. So when you do this, when you add these, you get 6.8, and again, it's rounded to one decimal place. So we round because we're gonna later divide, which is a different operation. Here, it's 0.04, but it's not to one decimal place, it's to two. So the way you do that, the way you change it to one decimal place would be to change it to scientific notation, and then you get 170. Remember, when you divide, you round to the least sig fig, um, which ends up being uh, which ends up being 2. So there should be 2 sig figs at the end. So your answer should be 1.7 times 10 to the 2. Okay, because you're rounding to 2 sig figs, right? 2 sig figs. So I actually made a small mistake there. See, that's what happens when your teacher rushes a PowerPoint and is also teaching AP Chem for the first time. Okay, now, because I'm afraid of my time limit, I want you guys to take a small break. Take a small break, digest everything about Sig Figs, and try to understand this one more time, and then listen to the third part of the podcast, which is just gonna be 5 more minutes. Okay, I know this is a lot, but just bear with me. That's why you shouldn't be doing this last minute. Hopefully, you're not doing it last minute. All right, so take a small break. All right, here we go.